Hey, everybody, it's Lorissa Rinehart here on the Female Body Politic. Thanks for joining me today. I'm waiting right now for Jane Ruby, who is the president of the League of Women Voters in Chicago. She has been on the ground doing so much work in the protests that are happening there. And I wanted to talk to her about what's going on, how it feels, and what this continued escalation of the attack on the American people by the Trump regime has been playing out in real time. Um, so, Jane, I'm going to send you this invite again. I think I'm having some technical difficulties, as is usually the way. Here's Jane. Thanks so much, Jane. Thanks for joining me. I was just telling everybody that I wanted to have you on to talk about what's going on in Chicago, the escalation of Trump's attacks on American cities. I've been following the news, and I'm not in a state of shock, but I'm in a state of rage and deep concern for folks there. So I just wanted to talk to you and get a sense of what's going on and how you're feeling. So can you talk a little bit first about the League of Women Voters Chicago and what you all are doing in Chicago around these attacks by ICE?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Always always down to talk. Unfortunately, it's under these circumstances. For our next chat, it's pretty surreal here. You know, Democracy, or, when in my sort of cheerleader role with the league, and when I do talks and talk to people about participating, talk to people about voting, get people excited, you often never think, or I often have to say things like, democracy is really fragile and you have to participate in order for it to work. You talk about it, but you never really think you're going to be in a situation quite as dire as what we're seeing right now here in Chicago. Um, Even in my neighborhood, like, people are being ripped from their schools, from their homes. Um, my husband is volunteering to do patrols of local schools to ensure that, at pickup and drop off, no one's being just taken. It's really all hands on deck. Um, and it's s- scary, but also really inspiring. I think as someone outside of Chicago, like, outside of the trenches, you're seeing a lot of stories of, people rising to the occasion, protesters, um, people building sense of community. And so, you know, that's kind of what's keeping us going.
Yeah, I mean, I was just watching an interview with Reverend David Black, who was, of course, the priest who was pepperballed and then sprayed in the face with tear gas. And he talked about how he was drenched with chemical weapons from head to toe. And, he's not alone in suffering these assaults. And yet, the thing that really struck me was that, right, they were coming after him. They, in a way, from what he describes it, and I believe him, they targeted him as a member of the clergy. And as they were continuing to assault him, other members of the protest covered him with their bodies. And at this point, he was completely disabled, and this is the kind of thing, and I don't mean this in a pejorative way, but that you hear from Myanmar and Indonesia when people are doing pro-democracy work, where they are just being absolutely assaulted to the point of physical, like permanent physical disability. And yet we're seeing that on the streets of America right now. And I'm so encouraged that you say that there's a lot of community growing around this, but what is the feeling like when I want to get the feel now, you all are going out and are you fearful that
Yeah, I mean,
uh,
I've been to as many of the protests as that I possibly can, both in my capacity as a concerned citizen, but also in my capacity as president of the League of Women Voters of Chicago, to stand in solidarity with, the organizations in particular who are even more in the trenches than we are. And it's actually quite surreal, especially when you're sort of marching and I guess, really anyway, where it's like, the people who are marching, we obviously have a heightened sense of like responsibility, in participating. And then you always have the people who are like standing off to the side, like making fun of you or videoing you or, you know, uh, being trolls. You also have the people who are videoing you or asking questions about why you're doing this. And, you always just talk to them and they're just like interested in the movement. But the thing that's really surreal are the people who, just are confused as to what's going on. Um, who are just being like, "Why are these people here? Why are they marching? Why is this a thing?" And just, like, genuinely just so completely tuned out as to what's happening. And it's really that gray area space is the state base that, I'm most concerned with because, you know, there are a lot of people who are still not paying attention to what's going on as, people are literally being kidnapped off the streets. That's an everybody person problem. It's not a partisan problem. It's not, a certain kind of person's problem. It's not a classist problem. It is an everybody's problem that, Americans are being kidnapped. People who are coming here who have the right to be here are being kidnapped.
Yeah, and children are being traumatized for life. Watching their parents kidnapped or being kidnapped themselves or watching
Yeah.
incredible violence happening. And you talk about these folks who are checked out. That is shocking to me, right? In Chicago, which is such a metropolitan center, um, sort of well known for how being highly educated and involved and just like aware. And yet there's still this element of folks who don't know what's going on. And I often worry that here on Substack, right, I am siloed just along with everyone else in their individual channels. And so I'm curious when you're talking to these folks, do you feel like you are getting through or your community is getting through this, veil of I don't mean to be mean, but like apathy and
Yeah.
ignorance, like are you getting through in real life?
I think the situation that happened last week, which, finally has sort of broken through the mainstream media, but where you have Black Hawk helicopters landing on the roof of a south side of Chicago apartment building and people are yanked out of their beds in the middle of the night. Kids are zip tied. Like, I think it took a while for that to like break into mainstream media. Like, I kept calling my mom in New York being like, "Why aren't you hearing about this? Why aren't you hearing about it?" She's like, "I'm on the news. They're not getting it yet." Um, but I think if nothing else, that situation was kind of so next level, which is, like, wild to say because I feel like every situation that's transpired here with ICE and troops and, escalation from the federal government has been next level, but I think that situation and that, um my hope is that when people hear about that and understand what happened there, that could happen anywhere. That was sort of, I think, a real turning point in the conversation where it wasn't a them problem. It wasn't, it wasn't a problem that was happening to other people. It was something that could literally happen to any American in this country.
Mhm. Yeah, and I mean, increasingly so I was just watching Robert Reich, who was talking about Trump's four-point plan to basically implement the Insurrection Act. And we can say right now, well, it can't, Jane, we can't happen to us because we are natural born citizens and my grandparents were born here. But once you declare the Insurrection Act, right, then habeas corpus is completely suspended. And now you do have the situation where it doesn't matter You could have come, your ancestors could have come on over on the Mayflower. At
Mhm.
this point, it is your problem. It is your reality. And so, yeah, I'm just from a strategic position. I'm curious to know what you think about the Trump regime staging this very performative, very violent, and very conspicuous raid on this vulnerable population in Chicago in particular. Do you think there's a reason why they're attacking Chicago so intensely? I mean, I know they're in Portland and Los Angeles, but I feel
Mhm.
like so many of the most brutal stories are coming out of Chicago. Is it like, do you know if there's a reason for that, or do you have a feeling of why?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in order to get to the root cause of that, a lot of people have to have a lot of uncomfortable conversations around race and class. Chicago is a very segregated city. It is very much historically rooted in a lot of really intense battles over civil rights, over equity, over positive change, both, negatively, but also, there's a lot of incredible people that have done civil rights work here in Chicago. So there's a storied history of incredible activist work here. Um, but at the root cause of it, like there are members of the executive branch who are racists, who are targeting our city. We have a black mayor. There's been some absolutely disgusting stuff said about leadership in our city and our state by other elected officials in positions of power. You can't ignore race. You can't ignore the fact that, we're a huge immigrant population in our city, and it's kind of like the perfect staging ground for this sort of, attack that we're probably gonna be seeing in other places and have already started to see in other places.
Yes, and it really is exactly as you say, staging ground, right? Like you see military bases that are built like cities, right? So that the military can practice urban warfare, or there are specific military bases that have environments that mimic other environments that the military will go into. And that's how they practice to then, you know, plan an invasion. And we're seeing, right, it is both an invasion and it is a staging for a larger invasion. And, one of the things that is so deeply, deeply, deeply concerning to me about this situation is that it's the National Guard, right? Of course, that's problematic enough. But then you have ICE. And ICE is really moving beyond immigration, control and into civilian policing, but without any kinds of rules of engagement. And, how do we, I mean, this is sort of in the future, but do we just need to like defund ICE in the future? Is there any going back from this other than just completely shutting it down?
I mean, I think ICE has sort of been kind of the test case for sort of a larger, militarized militia, um, trained to, go after people, that, uh, the federal, like, the executive branch would like to go after. And that's the truth. I mean, in my neighborhood alone, the other day I was on a Zoom call with some league people and I get a text notification and it's like, oh yeah, like stay home because ICE is in the area and they tear gassed a local grocery store. Like, so, a lot of what you're seeing in Broadview, Illinois, like, at the ICE detention center, like, a lot of that is, it's equally horrifying, but it's also in a contained area. But now they're going into neighborhood communities and feeling like they can use tear gas on people in residential areas. Like, a family that was just walking by the grocery store, like, just, walking by, living their life, and had a 2-year-old child, they were tear gassed.
How is what was this reported? Was this reported on?
I
I'm
mean, yeah, no, these are things that, need to get reported out. But I mean, that just happened less than a mile from, where I was doing a Zoom. And it was like, oh, okay, we need to be talking about the use of tear gas in residential areas. And, you know, thank thank God that the elected officials in Illinois are who they are. And a
Mhm.
lot of them, have background in, uh, you know, protest and civil disobedience and being on the right side of history and, fighting for what's right, protecting immigrants, you know, thank goodness we have these people in positions of power here in Illinois to stand up and fight back against these things, both at the hyper local level. Our city council, our alder people have been such heroes in putting their bodies on the line for protecting people here in this country. Our state representatives, our state senators have been organizing patrols and signage and know your rights trainings. Organizations like the League and others, around immigration, we have been doing tons of events, tons of protests, really trying to get the word out to every single person. At, our mayor's office has been incredible. Like, I mean, everyone should be following the the press coverage for out of the Chicago mayor's account, because oh my gosh, has he really risen to the occasion. These executive orders that he's issuing are some of the only actual defenses against ICE right now in our communities. Um, that is truly an act of resistance. At the state level, our governor and our attorney general's offices, there's pending lawsuit to get the National Guard out. And there was a big success today, or this week, on that front. But the fight isn't over, and people and our elected officials, our community organizers are working overtime to defend and protect people here. But I mean, you had mentioned checkpoints. Like, there's a bunch of just like ICE showing up and being like, "Hey, where's your ID?"
okay. Let's get back to that in a minute, but I want to talk about because I mean, this is like, where are your papers?
Mhm,
Really, that's what they're saying. Where are
yeah,
your papers?
mhm,
So, I mean, and I don't like to always, you know, use the metaphor and have it be compared to the Nazis. I think it's overblown often and hyperbolic and overused. But if you're like, where's your ID? Just, that's basically you're saying, show me your papers, which is a classic Nazi request. But I want to go back to the Dems and their leadership. And specifically, I'm hoping that you can share the story of the local alderman, who and whose name is escaping me right now, but who stood up to ICE at the hospital that were trying to take a man without a warrant and put her body online. Could you just share that story really quickly with our viewers?
yeah. In the 26th ward of Chicago, which is a predominantly Latino area of the city, one of our alder people went to the ICE was chasing someone. He got hurt and it was at the hospital. And the alderwoman for the ward, Jesse Fuentes, put her body on the line. And, we have to start using phrases like that, people putting their bodies on the line to protect our community. And ICE aggressively manhandled her and arrested her
Yeah, the
for
way.
asking for a valid judicial warrant. And that is where we're at. Our elected officials are getting arrested
Yeah.
for upholding the law, protecting people.
And just so everybody knows, she identified herself as an elected official. She was nonviolent, didn't raise her voice, completely, respectful insofar as you can be. Pardon me. And you mentioned that they manhandled her. They absolutely pushed her elbows together behind her, which, if you have ever been handcuffed, you know that that is exceptionally painful and
Mhm.
can actually lead to long-term damage. So it was beyond just sort of, put your hands behind your back. It was a violent a- arrest. How is she doing? Have you heard from her since she was released?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, we have some of the most, and I don't know if we're allowed to curse on on
I think
Substack, but
so.
the most badass activists and strong uh like people meeting the moment here. Like, I couldn't be more proud of these elected officials in our area. I love, working with them on other projects, but to see them step into these roles and do what's right, because it is, we're really at a point of, there is a right and there is a wrong. And we all have to meet the moment and do what's right to protect each other. She's spoke she luckily that story kind of broke mainstream media, and so she's appeared on some mainstream media to tell her story because it's a really powerful one, and it's one we can't forget. You know, Hopefully all of this passes soon, but we can't forget what happened. And too often, things, especially in short term memory, are not remembered in the same way. And so it's really important to, hopefully ICE gets the hell out of Chicago very soon. And hopefully they don't terrorize any more cities or any more people in our country, but until then, we can't forget that these are things that are happening. You mentioned that it feels, very much like, the show me your papers kind of thing. Like, I mean, we're at the point where you walk around the neighborhood and there's signs everywhere being like, no ICE, like, you need a judicial warrant, like businesses, homes, everything is just about, protecting each other and for people to know what their rights are in case they're stopped, because at any point people can be stopped.
Yeah, and I'm so curious, right? Because what you're describing in the community that's being built in Chicago, and that the way that the local and hyper local elected officials are standing up is really interesting to me, right? Because we are talking earlier about why the Trump regime has specifically targeted Chicago with some of its most violent and brutal and blatant attacks. And I'm like, do they know that if they can break this city, right, then they can go elsewhere? Whereas it seems like Chicago is proving to be a really powerful model to other cities about what can be achieved. So that's really encouraging to hear that folks are standing together. The other thing I wanted to ask you about is I'm seeing on social media, and I want to know if it's true because I hope it is ICE is unable to, find a bathroom, go to a restaurant, get any sleep. Is that really happening? Are people really rejecting ICE in every capacity throughout the city?
Yeah, so and I think there's been a lot of lessons that organizers in Chicago have taken from what's happened in DC and what's happened in LA. That there are lessons to be learned for how to agitate and aggravate the bullies coming in to make them uncomfortable. Um, yeah, no, it's been wild. So there's like a sort of this texting platform where you can opt into it and you get notified like if ICE is in the area and stuff. And so there's been great like instant reporting on what's going on like in the moment and you get like notified. But it's been great because it's like, there was a gym where there was a bunch of ICE people like working out and it was like get to the gym and like make them feel uncomfortable that they've like leave the gym, or like ICE isn't welcome on private property, so like businesses and people can say like no, you can't be here. There was an executive order this week that our mayor's office did about they can't stage on Chicago property, so things like lots that are owned by the city or parks, they can't sort of convene and create an ICE staging facility, which also sort of severely contracts their ability to organize operations, which is why I think they've also sort of resorted to doing a lot of the checkpoint things, because those are things that, they could just like park a car and then, ask people for their address.
Honey, no, no, not right now. Sorry, my little toddler was coming in.
So it's like, it's things like doing the checkpoints we're starting to see a lot more of just because of the constriction of their ability to, stage big operations, here in the city and like, have a tent or big vans and stuff. So, there's I mean, you're seeing like some incredible videos of like cars honking and people like following these ice vehicles around the city and like trying to chase them out, and it's like more of that. Anyone who is willing to like, go drive around for a few minutes and try to, make these people feel uncomfortable, like power to them. That is truly sort of, community organizing at its best. And, it's very, Revolutionary War, esque, a lot of that kind of like guerrilla fighting at the hyper local level. Like these people are coming from other states. They don't know our turf the way that we do.
Yes, and it really is becoming I want to say guerrilla warfare, right? Because I don't want to inject. I mean, violence is being perpetrated against peaceful protesters, but there are opportunities to use or utilize the tactics of guerrilla warfare against, right, these occupying forces, and one of them is through exactly knowing your territory better than they do and leveraging that against them and their inability to effectively, militarize that space. Now, if you will hold on one moment, this
Yes.
is particular to moms, but I hear my toddler outside and I'm not sure where grandma is. So everyone bear with me. Let me see. Penny, where's grandma? Mommy's on the live right now.
I'm laughing because that's such the vibe too. Like my toddler is taking a quick nap, so but that mom life and political life, we really have to balance that.
Yeah, it's like all together all at once. And it's the other thing is like I want to protect my children so much from all of this, and to just have this conversation with you and other folks like you doing this important work, and then to be able to step away from it and just be joyful with my kids and let them have
Oh
their
my
child,
gosh.
you
That
know?
is a huge thing right now. It's like, I've been talking with sort of a play group, in my area about, they're concerned, what would happen if they get stopped by ICE or whatever. So, helping even like, a toddler play group figure out, what a plan looks like, or, advising on whether like 2-year-olds should carry around copies of their birth certificate, like, in their backpack is just such kind of a surreal thing, and it's so hard because it's like you wanna protect, like, no kid sh no, this is not the burden of any child. This is the burden of sort of the adults to figure this out.
Right.
Um, but, and luckily, like, my son is too young to like, he won't remember this day. He'll just, read about it, hopefully in the history books, and that. But, how do you even balance sort of childhood when, people are being kidnapped on your street? And, there's so much there about protecting the kids, protecting each other, and you know, it's just really, really surreal. And, more power to all the parents out there that are really kind of having to balance parenthood and, the joys of Halloween coming up and their kids, living their life, or, playing in a pile of leaves outside, with also, knowing that kids their age were zip tied in the middle of the night and taken out of their beds. It's really, really weird to, straddle both of those worlds.
Yeah. I would say though, and I talk to particularly a lot of moms who are doing justice work, and even though I'm immersed in it every day, right? It is far easier, I think, for me to do that justice work, know I'm working on the solution, than if I were
Mhm.
not acting. Because there is such joy in the work and there's such great community. And I have to say, meeting you and so many other women has been who are doing this work has really been the privilege and honor of my lifetime. And I'm sorry that it's been under these circumstances, but I'm glad that I've come to know you all. And I know you've talked about this, but like, what's your experience been in, you know, community building, not just in Chicago, but around the country? Maybe particularly you can talk about the League of Women Voters, since you are the president of the League of Women Voters Chicago, and how they are creating these resilient networks of resistance.
Yeah, it's a weird space because, we are not a nonpartisan organization, so we don't endorse parties or candidates, which to me is really, as I've talked about before, is really kind of freeing and liberating because I can focus on issues as opposed to, being beholden to party agendas and stuff. Um, but, a lot of people are like, how can the League of Women Voters, come out with a statement saying we're in a constitutional crisis? Like, that's partisan. Or how can the League be a national partner for No King's Day? Like, that's partisan. And it's like, you know, before we get into parties or any of the politics of party dynamics or candidates or things like that, like, democracy isn't a partisan issue. It's something
Democracy is
that is
nonpartisan.
yeah, democracy, there's no, like, bipartisan, no nonpartisan, it's just there's no it's so much higher than, before we get into any of those sorts of, much more divisive things, and that's really where, we've been able to take strong stands on what's right and what's wrong in the protecting and preserving of our democracy and our republic, I've used way too much in conversations recently, but, it's an important anecdote. It's, when, the Constitutional Convention finished and Ben Franklin was walking out of Independence Hall, a woman asked him, "So, like, what do we have? Do we have a monarchy, or what's our what do we have?" And he says, "A republic if you can keep it."
Hmm.
And, I think that that is something that, we really need to be thinking about in kind of every aspect of our lives, like, it's always going to be fragile, what I said earlier on, and, it's we can we can keep our democracy going if we're all, vigilant in its protection and its sanctity.
But
And so, that's really where the League of Women Voters is an incredible resource, both nationally, statewide, and local in, the preservation of democracy, the expanding of democracy where it needs to be expanded, and, the education so we have an informed and active voting population here in our country.
yeah, and I just find it so interesting, right, that a woman asked Benjamin Franklin, "What do we have, a monarchy or a republic?" Right? Because she didn't have the right to vote and didn't have a voice in
Mhm.
whatever that was, whether it was a democracy or rather a democracy or a monarchy. And yet
Yeah.
she's the one who's curious about this. And I want to address, somebody just mentioned Prop 50 that's coming up in California. For everybody who doesn't know, Prop 50 is a ballot initiative that would redistrict California to grant Democrats five more congressional seats to counteract what's being done in Texas and other states that are, gerrymandering to disenfranchise voters. But first of all, if you live in California, please vote for Prop 50. I say, Jane's not going to. I don't want to speak on behalf of the voting voters, but I say vote. But the thing is that we live, right. Our political system has not evolved to really give people a voice in our government, right? We are just, I would say, a little bit ahead of that woman asking Benjamin Franklin what we have. when our votes don't count because of the electoral college, or, somebody in Missouri has a greater vote than I do in California, or when someone is, disenfranchised by gerrymandered districts, right? That's not democracy. That is sort of a, you know, jerry rigged system meant for the powerful. And so, just going back to this idea of how to grow our democracy, I really think that with this coming special elections and the midterm elections, if and when we win, I think we need to pressure Democrats to make sweeping electoral reforms immediately. And so, first of all, Jan, I want to ask you if you agree. And second of all, what kind of electoral reforms would you like to see implemented, day one, hit the ground running?
Well, yeah. So first of all, I just want to preface. So the League of Women Voters, we are against sort of all all gerrymandering. So that's just sort of like our official position on that. So just clarifying that everyone's allowed to vote however they want to on Prop 50. Um, but in terms of it's always such a hard thing because it's like, we have there are things that work in our democracy, and those are the things that we're really looking to preserve. But hey, our government has failed us on the ERA. Um, there are lots of people who are still disenfranchised, and we're seeing now, from the Supreme Court down, rights are trying to be stripped from so many people. So, once we're over this, whatever this is right now, there's going to be a lot of, work to be done as to what comes after. Um, I think your point about, it doesn't matter Democrat, Republican, everyone should be looking to strengthen our democracy, expand electoral reform, voting rights. Voting rights benefit everybody. It doesn't matter what political party you are on. Like, if you're so concerned that you're trying to take away rights from someone, then maybe you need to look at what your platform is for your party or your campaign, and maybe reassess what you stand for, as opposed to just cheating and taking away voting rights from someone else. Like, you should be able to be so firm in your position, no matter who you are, that, someone who is an informed voter will vote for you, as opposed to doing this whole thing of, let's just take away voting rights from people so then they can't vote against us. So everyone should be pushing towards election reform that is a much more inclusive of all of our population. That's, expanding vote by mail. It's expanding, making voter registration easier no matter where you are. It is ensuring that, hey, let's make election day a holiday. So then
Please,
people
can we
don't
do
have an
that already?
excuse. So then people don't have an excuse to not vote because they have work, or they have to, figure out what to do with their kid. Like, there's so many things that just universally benefit everyone that, we see in other parts of the world that, have shown to strengthen and be a much more inclusive democracy. So I really think that, it's an everyone problem. And, both in our two-party system, like, both parties benefit off of disenfranchisement, and, you know, whether it's fundraising, whether it's voting, whether it's policy positions, whether it's dark money in politics. And we really need to get back to, our role as citizens first and foremost, and that is a nonpartisan position too. Your role as being an active and informed participant in our society should come before who you are as a party or position. And that's where voting rights really does live in, is that, that's that tier of citizenship that really comes before everything else.
Yeah, and we're running out of time here, but I want to bring it back to Chicago, right? Because what's going on there on the ground right now is really indicative, I think, of a lived history for a lot of people, right? Where a lot of the American population, for the majority of our history, have lived on that knife's edge of fascism or authoritarianism, right? Like, one missed paycheck, one false arrest, one turn down the wrong street and you lose your freedom. And that's true of people of color, of Black people, of people of the LGBTQ plus community, and that always, and other marginalized folks. And that's always been true. And yet we're seeing that reality bleed into the sort of more privileged white reality that you and I, if I can say, Jane, live. And I wonder how we can communicate what's going on in Chicago, communicate that that reality is an everyone problem now because it's an everyone problem in Chicago to the wider, U.S. population, not just in urban centers, major urban centers, but maybe also smaller urban centers and even, you know, more rural areas too that are seeing their lives being negatively impacted by the Trump regime's policies. How
Yeah.
can we communicate better?
Well, I think we just need to get out there, and a lot of it is uncomfortable conversations. It's uncomfortable conversations around race. It's uncomfortable conversations around class. Um, we don't have class solidarity in ways that we need. We don't have race acknowledgement in the ways that we really need, and that is very much a white people problem too. I think what something else that's been really inspiring here in Chicago is, a lot of white privileged people are putting their bodies on the line. They're going out to Broadview from, all over the state, all over the country. People are coming to Broadview um to take a stand there, and they're getting all kinds of people are getting pepper sprayed. A lot of white people are getting pepper sprayed and, shot with the rubber bullets and such. It's like they're really putting their bodies on the line to show that we're all in this together. My husband doing patrols in the neighborhood, he's a privileged white man. He's going out there because, as a white privileged man, it's the right thing to do. It's what, we all should be doing in whatever capacity we can be. It's like not everyone has to put their bodies on the line, which is, important to say. There are people that, if that's something that they're not comfortable with, there's plenty of other ways to get involved. You can go put signs out. Know your rights, go to know your rights trainings. There's you can drive around and get groceries for people who might be scared to leave their house. There's so many different ways that you can meet the moment and participate and be involved. No matter what color skin you have, no matter how much money you have, no matter whether you work or not, there is opportunities for all of us to show up, all of us to meet the moment. And, that's really where what makes sort of what's happening here in Chicago's like the resistance here in Chicago really special because you really are seeing that diversity.
Yeah. So on that note, I just want to ask you one last question, which is
Yeah.
how can we support you in the work that you're doing in Chicago and that other folks are doing in Chicago? Because I really, I am I feel like we have to support each other across state lines because in these embattled zones, right, we need to be able to stand with you. So how can we get involved in what you're doing? How can we support what the League of Women Voters is doing or any other organization
I
there?
mean, always, in is my plug to join the league. We have chapters all around the country at the local, state, and national levels. There's incredible work being done around the country. We're a national partner for the No Kings protest that's happening next weekend. Find your local league, show up to the No Kings protest. That's definitely one way, in your own communities you can be doing stuff. There's incredible organizations that we work with. One of our big partner organizations is and I can put it in the chat while I'm
Right.
talking. But they've been doing incredible work. The Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights. They have been superstars in not only organizing Know Your Rights work, but organizing protests and being, the legal resource for all of these kidnappings that have been happening, and really being on the front lines. And so we're so in awe of their work and happy to be partners with them in amplifying what's happening here. But yeah, there's lots of really great immigrant resources, and just I think it's really important. We talk all the time about, like, when we're not in a constitutional crisis, like, can you pass a citizenship test? It's like you'll do like goofy things, but I think that there's so much information that we don't know as
Mm.
citizens just because we take for granted our rights and responsibilities as people in this country. So sort of my final plug is just like we all should just, like, know our rights. Like, what happens, if you get stopped by the cops and you're in your car, and it not related to ICE or anything, but just, like, how does the legal system work? How
Mhm.
does our 3 branches of government work? How does voting work? These are things that we should just know as people, and that kind of goes into that, like, tier of citizenship before who we are as people. But no matter where you are, like, read the Constitution, look up who your elected officials are, like, just basic things, because you never know if you're gonna be put in a situation where you might need to pull out this information. It's probably a good idea to have, know where all of your paperworks are. Like, put them in, a fireproof safety folder and just have everything ready. And those are things, like, not to, like, scare people, but it's just, like, it's good to know, what it means to be a citizen here and such. And so, I think if nothing else, like, everyone should just know their rights as people here.
Well, thank you so much, Jane. I always love talking with you, and I'm glad that you jumped on with me to talk about what's going on in Chicago, what's going on in Chicago, the situation with ICE and the Trump regime, and what we can do to support you and support each other and create community and build a more resilient democracy. I'm just always in awe of the work that you're doing. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me and for everyone joining, and, may the force be with us all.
Yes, absolutely. We'll check in again soon, Jane. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.